Hello and welcome to part number 2 on the Omegawave education curriculum. In this part, we will look at the Omegawave technology and what we actually measure, and we will also briefly discuss basic guidelines into how to interpret these results. So Val, could you please explain what the Omegawave technology measures?
What we measure, but why we measure is much more important probably. And to understand why we choose these particular methods, I will need to explain that the original objective was to create a system that will help coaches control training process from day to day. And to control it on a daily basis, to make training process more controllable and predictable, we needed to make sure that data available to you on a daily basis, which means data has to be, or at least technologies or methods that we would use have to be non-invasive, non-stressful. The data should be collected relatively easy, and results of the data should be available right on the spot. And of course, when you consider all of those criteria, the best methods to achieve that would be methods designed by electrophysiology, because electrophysiology, unlike other methods, do not require stressful applications, needles, stress tests, and so on. So let's start with, in my opinion, one of the most important assessments in our system, especially if performed in the original format that we design. It's the assessment of DC potential, or what we, in simple terms, we explain it as a overall power and capacity of nervous system to provide for compensatory and adaptive responses of the organism. It's kind of as a summary index that allows us to understand how human organism adapts and compensates for changes in environment, which training is change in environment, right? So DC potential measures slow physiological processes in the brain between 0 and 0. Classic DC potential 0.5 millivolts. In our particular case, when we talk about omega waves, it's 0 to 0.05 millivolts. But both of those, of course, are part of DC potential. That allowed us to analyze multiple responses of the body, in particular, the central nervous system response, basically level of hyperactivity in nervous system in response to physical or mental activity, or level of hypoactivity. The second method that we choose was method of heart rate variability, which, as we know, in modern form originated in the former Soviet Union around 1950s or so, was primarily used for Russian space program and designed by space medicine facilities under Professor Bayevsky. So our heart rate variability derived from full analysis of ECG, because we found out that to be accurate in assessment of heart rate variability, it's absolutely crucial to identify properly R segments. We can do that a lot better from ECG signal than from PPGs, for example, pulsometry. Heart rate variability in our particular solution provides only fraction of the whole picture of human response to training. In particular, the autonomic part of central nervous system and its effect on the cardiac functioning. In other words, our heart rate variability studies the regulatory process that controls cardiac function. So we analyze type of rhythm, changes in the rhythm in response to training. We analyze autonomic balance, sympathetic versus parasympathetic nervous system. We derive breathing influences from heart rate variability. And by doing that, we can actually identify level of stress accumulated in the cardiac system in response to acute or chronic stimulus. So, but measuring regulation of cardiac system in itself is not sufficient because it doesn't tell us anything about the cardiac pump as a muscle itself. And therefore, we decided that we will be also putting additional method of ECG analysis, since we already collecting ECG to analyze heart rate variability, and that method calls amplitude frequency analysis of ECG. So basically, we study in speed of depolarization and repolarization in the myocardium. And based on research performed in Ukraine, Brazil, United States, we design a way through analysis of ECG to observe what type of stressors were primary applied, aerobic or anaerobic in nature. And by observing those changes in ECG, because ECG changes affected by physical type of exertion and hypoxia in the organism, we can determine which systems were primary stressed and used as a compensation responses, aerobic or anaerobic. But continuously monitoring those changes from day to day, we can also identify how successfully organism adapts to those aerobic or anaerobic stressors and compensates for them. In other way, we can monitor multiple curves of supercompensation. Compensations in the nervous system, autonomic nervous system, aerobic and aerobic systems, as well in the cardiac and cardiopulmonary function. Okay. So that was the primary reason of why we chose these particular methods. And I hope I explained what these methods measure.
Yes, you did, Val, and thanks for that very comprehensive explanation. Now, you also already touched upon the interpretation part of the data. Now, let's move on with that. And could you please explain, Val, if we start with DC potential, how should a coach start to evaluate the data we give on the app concerning DC potential?
Let's start with the above the norm. So the typical time when we observe DC potential above norm is with mental stressors, especially in the pre-competition type of periods where the nervous system is activated above the norm in preparation for performance. That means with higher than normal state of DC potential, we expect that system is ready to support physical activity, but it will support it by burning lots of resources, or the resources that functional resources that organism has will be expended with much higher intensity. So if it's a short-term condition, just observe prior competition, that's okay. Even though there is one probable limitation in that type of hyperactive state. If it's just a sprint, it might be okay. But with highly technical applications, this hyperactive state might affect their ability to produce optimal biomechanical movements. And of course, the cost of physical activity during states when DC potential is above the norm is above normal. It means the fatigue stages might be achieved significantly sooner.
So Val, interestingly, you mentioned that when you're in a hyperactive state of the DC potential, it can affect negatively your performance. Now, does that have any relation to muscles? That when you're in a hyperactive state, the muscles tense up as well?
Highly complicated movements, biomechanical movements, are controlled by central nervous system. Mm-hmm. And with central nervous system being hyperactive, mm-hmm. the precision at which it can control musculoskeletal system is decreased. Okay. So it has nothing to do with the muscle per se. It has all to do with how nervous system regulates muscle function.
So as we know, the app itself actually offers quite good advice to any user as to what to do when you see any kind of result. You can simply click on the windows of trainability of endurance, power and speed, strength or coordination skill, and see what the advice is. But in addition to that, could you please, Val, explain broad guidelines when it comes to DC potential in particular? What can a coach do when they see one or the other result, either hyperactivation or hypo-activation?
In particular, hyperactive state can limit your ability in a technical application and increases the cost of physical activity by spending the resources more aggressively. So based on understanding of these limitations, we can also deduct that for training processes during this time, prolonged high volume processes of training might be of high intensity work, might be somewhat not optimal, and highly complicated processes where they have to perform their technique at the maximum capacity might be also not advised, unless it's a competition, because during the competition, I would expect it's okay. Now, low intensity type of activity in this state, even of a moderate to high volume, are still okay, as they will actually help to bring the extra excitation of the system down to normal ranges. So that's from a hyperactive state. Hypoactive state, on the other hand, might create different limitations. For example, if hyperactive state create limitations in technical application from standpoint of psychological state and ability to control the movement, the hypoactive state will limit optimal biomechanical movement from standpoint of inability to recruit highest muscle fibers. So if I'm a shot putter or a javelin thrower or a pole vaulter or any other highly explosive event, my ability to perform my technical work with highest precision will be inhibited. And because of that, rather than learning the optimal skill, I will be kind of learning how to adapt to inability of nervous system to utilize highest threshold muscles, which means my technical execution might not be optimal to what I would like to be in the competition. So technical work of explosive type of activities during the phases of low functioning DC potential would not be advised. For the same precisely reason, maximum velocity activities would not be advised based on low DC potential, as we already know that the ability to recruit highest threshold muscles will be somewhat inhibited. And by putting more stressor of maximum power output or maximum velocity will continue to suppress the nervous system responses. So the training effect would be somewhat minimal. There is no need for creation of additional fatigue in those regulatory processes. So the optimal state for explosive and highly technical activities will be above 20 millivolts, and technical in endurance, let's say where technique performed and endurance activity can be done anywhere above 9 millivolts. Depending on the type of sport and how long the actual activity lasts in that sport, I would say for a sport that is short in duration, like jumpers or sprinters, there is probably multiple ways of what you can do to stimulate a temporary nervous system. Unfortunately, it will carry much higher cost, and their recovery time after that will take significantly longer. Those activities can include manual stimulation versus biochemical stimulation. I'm not going to discuss any biochemical stimulation. I'm sure many of our users found their own ways with caffeine, tea extracts, and other natural stimulants that are not banned by medical organizations. And by, of course, proper warm-up, electric stimulation, or other physical interventions, it also can be changed. But once again, it's probably never going to be as optimal as if they were in the proper state to begin with. And of course, the long-term cost of this type of stimulation will be non-beneficial for the athlete.
Now let's move on to the autonomic nervous system part of our system, which we obviously do via heart rate variability analysis. Val, can you please give our listeners a basic idea of how they can use this information to optimally plan their training?
Well, as we discussed before, heart rate variability gives us a good, clear picture of how autonomic nervous system affect function of cardiac system. It's a regulation channel of nervous system to regulate cardiac function. Based on analysis of heart rate variability, we can determine a couple things. In particular, is sympathetic and parasympathetic contribution to the regulation of the cardiac function. Based on level of activation of sympathetic or parasympathetic system, we can determine what suitable volumes and intensities of training in each state athletes can undergo. So, for example, people who are highly sympathetically dominated much better respond to stressors of very low intensity, even if those stressors are of moderate or high volume. And the opposite, people who are in the high parasympathetic dominant state, more likely to respond to high velocity activities of very low volume. So looking at heart rate variability, one of the important parts, we can determine limitations in volumes and intensities for every given training session.
Now, Val, given your years of experience in the world of coaching and exercise science, what would you say are the major limitations of HRV? And the reason why I'm asking this is, obviously, if you look at the current status of readiness technologies and general discussions on how to monitor readiness, a lot of it seems to be focused solely on HRV as a method. Now, can you, Val, talk a little bit more about what you find based on experience being the biggest limitation of just using HRV to monitor readiness?
Heart rate variability is great to measure autonomic regulation of cardiac muscle, but it doesn't give us full explanation of function of other major systems to create a full picture of adaptation. In particular, it doesn't give us a clear picture of overall functioning of central nervous system or energy systems or pulmonary system. So I want to say it's a very important method that if performed properly should give us a great non-specific indication of stress that affects cardiac system. But that's about it, because the same stress can affect other systems, and heart rate variability will not respond to it. For example, the better trained you are, the more autonomic regulation of cardiac system becomes. And even if you have muscular problems, and even if you have hormonal problems, they might not be immediately observed in a heart rate variability. And that's a big methodological limitation of trying to make decision on training just based on heart rate variability.
Now, what about in terms of specific sports categories? Have you, Val, seen that HRV is less valuable in certain types of sports, let's say pure speed sports, as opposed to the other end of the spectrum, endurance sports?
It has to be as one of the markers. So when you say less important, yes and no. So assuming you are in a good state of autonomic regulation as a sprinter, your changes in that system will be quite limited. It will be pretty stable, assuming it's good to begin with, right? And it's very crucial because we have data of multiple world champions, record holders in explosive events like shot put, sprinting, throwing. And we know for a fact that this population has very high parasympathetic dominance. But in their case, this high parasympathetic dominance is a good indicator of overall adaptation to training, but not necessarily the best predictor from day to day on how they adapt to training, because it's more stable and it doesn't change as much as we would think. So in that cases, the other methods can be utilized to see the effect of training on neuromuscular system, let's say not on the cardiac system, right? Because the primary stressors that we achieve through explosive training is not necessarily an autonomic system unless training selected improperly, but rather on a neuromuscular system. And having methods that help us to analyze neuromuscular responses and energy responses would be much more effective to monitor the effect of training. In endurance sports, of course, heart rate variability might take primary marker for overall training, but the same problem we observed in multiple endurance sports, where if we look at heart rate variability only, it would indicate that regulation is optimal with high parasympathetic tone. But at the same time, if we study the actual ECG signal, we can start seeing some significant limitations, in particular changes in ST segments, reverse S segments, or reverse T segments, which are indication of structural negative changes in the muscle itself of the cardiac system, not in the regulation. So that leads to some problems. That means that not all people that show great autonomic regulation necessarily show the great cardiac health or ability to sustain high intensity work. So in other words, what I'm trying to say here, part can never be better than a whole. And what we're trying to do, we're trying to create whole picture of adaptation to external stressors.
Now, if we move on to the third part of our systemic approach to assessing readiness, the ECG analysis, or what we call in the app the energy supply systems, Could you explain about what that is all about? What are we actually telling you, and how is that information relevant to optimizing training loads?
Well, it's quite actually simple method. It's much less complicated than people think about it. And in particular, as I said, we can look at analysis of ECG from two different standpoints. One as a red flag system to make sure we don't deal with athletes with typical for athletes cardiac problems. It's a great assessment of overall cardiac health. But that's not what we're going to discuss here. As important as it is, from day-to-day function, we need to quickly understand what type of loads athletes were under, and most importantly, how during recovery periods, how these athletes adapt into those loads. In particular, we measuring the changes in ECG in response to different type of loads. We measuring changes of amplitudes of QRS segments as well as T segments. So what science knows that when we talk about aerobic type of activities, the primary changes, acute changes, and chronic changes can be observed in changes in QRS segment of ECG, and with anaerobic type of activities, especially people spending lots of time in a hypoxic state, we can observe primary changes in response to training in the T segment or ST segment of ECG. So by studying those acute and chronic changes in ECG over time, our algorithms will show you how cardiac muscle adapts to training. So by looking at those changes, we can see if those changes were primarily produced by activation of aerobic regulatory processes or anaerobic regulatory processes. And what we found out through research, and that have been published and continue to get published, regardless of what type of stressor or what type of sport you do, when we talk about adaptation to exertion, it's always better to activate aerobic processes of compensation. So by looking at our parameters over time and looking the vector of how these parameters change in aerobic or anaerobic parameters, we can determine what compensatory system is primarily responsible for your regeneration. And we found out that activation of anaerobic system in response to training and adaptation to training normally more likely lead to increase of resources spent for training and recovery, and over time decrease in performance.
Val, I actually want to ask the same question that I asked when we were still discussing HRV, and this is about the generalization of this pattern that you just mentioned that is beneficial. Does it apply, based on your experience and knowledge of the method, does it apply across the field to all sports, or are there other types of patterns that you should observe if you wanted to observe a positive adaptation in certain sports? So if I'm training an MMA athlete or a cross-country skiing athlete, am I supposed to see the same kind of patterns or opposing patterns?
The answer is yes, because ECG is representation of effectiveness of cardiac pump. And based on that statement, it will be beneficial for any sport, regardless how much your cardiac system involved in the performance itself. For example, in a shot put, it's probably not involved as much as it is in 800 meters or 1500 meters. At the same time, it's a optimal function of your cardiac system that will allow you to quickly recover in between your attempts during the competition, and in general will allow you to recover and adapt to higher volumes of training, which means if you train properly, you can train more with less negative effect due to cardiac system ability to compensate rapidly for your stressors. So in that case, yes, my point is that it will be relevant for all sports.
Fantastic information, Val. Thanks a lot for your time and for your insights. Now, dear viewer, I hope you find this useful, and make sure to follow us on our website, on the social media, in order to get more of this type of content that we will definitely keep on producing as the days go by. So, make sure to stay tuned.